And the fundamental thing about neo-idealism is that it's a morally based approach to geopolitics, which is really grounded on the notion of our values and the values of democratic societies, classic liberal values, if you like.
Hi, welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's foreign policy podcast series, where we explore the implications of the emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, for our allies, friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And today I am delighted to be joined by my dear friend Benjamin Tallis, who is a senior associate at the Center for Liberal Modernity in Berlin, where in 2024 he's launching a major new project, the Democratic Strategy Initiative, which we'll talk as well, to build a strategic capacity and culture for liberal democracies need to win the systemic competition that we are in. Until June 2024, he was Senior Research Fellow at the GAP, German Council on Foreign Relations, where he led the flagship action group Zeitenwende, exploring Germany's geostrategic choices and providing options for the country to master its security transformation together with its allies. In this podcast, we focus quite a bit on the problem, the challenge, and the threat that is caused by Russia and China that the free world is facing increasingly. It is all well and good to talk about the threat and admire the problem, but it is also important to focus on what can we do. We do not want to slide into pessimism and inaction as a result. Our societies and our institutions are strong and dynamic, and we could and we should think about the solutions and how to overcome this series of challenges and threats to our society and our security and prosperity. And then has been providing a vision, a strategic vision, a grand strategy for liberal democracies, for the free world. That is called Neo-Idealism. And today we will talk on that. We recently have a report on Neo-Idealism as a grand strategy for the transatlantic community. It is published by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So we will put a link to the report. You should go and check that out. Today I want to focus on that and how that Neo-Idealism as a grand strategy in dealing with the challenges of Russia and China that we face today will link to your new initiative, the Democratic Security Initiative, as well. So, two important things, and thanks for joining me today, Ben.
Balkan, it's great to be with you. I'm a fan of Double Trouble. I'm a fan of MLI. I'm a fan of yours, as you know, and your work over the years. We've done lots of things together, and we've managed to have some very good discussions and also some good events together. And I'm excited to be on the podcast today. So let me kick off by saying that
please go ahead.
You're dead right that we can't just admire the problem. As President John Kennedy said some time ago, let us not despair, but act. And there are plenty of people who are despairing at the size of the challenges that we face, be those from the authoritarian states you mentioned as part of this systemic competition between democracies and autocracies. So challenges from Russia and China, who both threaten us in different ways. Challenges from their proxies, who are sowing chaos around the world, the Middle East in flames, et cetera, et cetera. But also the scale of the challenge we face in dealing with climate change and in mastering the technological transformation that we are undergoing with things like synthetic biology as well as artificial intelligence. And that is a lot. Let's not be sanguine about this. That is a lot to master. But if we don't actually gather the will to act, it's going to overwhelm us. And as someone who cares about the future of democracy, who wants my children and your children to live in freedom rather than in tyranny, and to actually have the chance of living better rather than worse lives, it was imperative to me to actually do something about this and to provide a framework through which we could do something about it. So that's why I started developing what I call Neo-Idealism.
Let's then give our audience a broad overview of what Neo-Idealism is, and then we can get into details in which you quite nicely put the 8 pillars of Neo-Idealism as a grand strategy. But before getting that, what do we mean by neo-idealism, and why you think it's the right way to think about international politics as a way forward?
Sure, we'll get onto those 8 handy tricks to save the world later, the pillars of neo-idealism. But it's important to say what it is, but also where it comes from. So where did this come from? It came from 2 main sources. One is the responses that I saw to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, responses from Ukrainians themselves, from the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, but also from the leaders of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Czechia, Poland, and even of the European Commission. So we're talking about leaders like Kaja Kallas, Gabrielis Landsbergis in Lithuania, Jan Lipavsky in the Czech Republic, who I thought were doing something different in response to this invasion that I'd seen before. And I've been working on Ukraine and on European security and Central Eastern European politics for a long time, for more than 2 decades now. And I thought there was something really different in this approach that was combining a very strong commitment to hard security. So to understanding we have to defend ourselves and we have to have the means to defend ourselves, but combining it with a moral rhetoric that really made clear that Ukraine's fight was just one front in a wider struggle of freedom against tyranny, and justifying the use of this hard power on that basis. And this also applied to leaders like Ursula von der Leyen at the European Commission, who took a very bold stance on Ukraine's membership of the EU, for example, upturned 2 decades of EU policy on Ukraine in 2 sentences on the 27th of February back in February 2022. So I was looking at that and thinking, what is it that's different this time? And having thought that might have actually opened a door to a different kind of geopolitics, a better approach to international relations, I set myself the task of saying, well, how do we actually combine this? How do we draw out what are the common elements? How do we make it consistent and round it out? And it also came from a dissatisfaction that I think you feel as well. We've both been at many international relations conferences over the years, a dissatisfaction with the extant approaches in both international relations and grand strategy. So primarily realism in international relations and academic theory, but of course that also bled over into practice. The restraint school of grand strategy, neoconservatism, having proved itself to have hubristically overreached and created chaos in the Middle East and also much damage to our self-confidence. And also liberal internationalism, which seemed to me, at least, to have become more of a zombie version of itself. Having served great purpose at various times in its history, it had become hollowed out and become really depoliticized and, frankly, unfit for purpose. So seeing something new emerging, combined with dissatisfaction with what there was available, that's what I thought, okay, there's an opening here to actually build on this, to use it as a springboard and then fully develop it. So I tried to draw out what I thought were the common aspects and what differentiated it from those existing approaches. And the fundamental thing about neo-idealism is that it's a morally based approach to geopolitics, which is really grounded on the notion of our values and the values of democratic societies, classic liberal values, if you like, of fundamental freedoms, human rights, democratic governance, the rule of law, self-determination for free societies, the right to choose which alliances you want to try and be part of, and to not have imperial spheres of influence or subjugation imposed upon you. So taking those as the core, but actually not saying that these are secondary to our interests, saying that these values are our fundamental interests. And that is in a way the big shift that is at the heart of neo-idealism, which drives everything else. And conceiving those values as ideals to strive for is extremely important as well, because it allows for the idea of progress towards, and it allows for that sense of striving, that sense of agency. And both you and I have objected in the past to the dominance of structure over agency in a lot of international relations work, but this puts people back in the picture. And it says, if you work towards this, this will actually bring a better outcome, not just for your society, but for your international relations as well, if you can develop a coherent program, a grand strategy that would actually align the sources of your power in that pursuit. So that's where it comes from. And it adds one last crucial thing, which is the right of citizens in free societies to a hopeful future. That kind of rounds it out there and gives it that's the bumper sticker, if you like, for what neo-idealism is as a grand strategy. And as you say, I've outlined many different pillars of that. Happy to talk more about it in a second. But I think that's what you need to know, basically, if you want to understand neo-idealism.
No, what I really like about it, and we have been talking about this over the years, is, two parts. One, it is firmly, build upon on practice. As you pointed out, different leaders, particularly coming from Central and Eastern Europe, but also the European Union. From their practice. So it is not some abstract thing that is being floated out in the ivory tower, but it very firmly embedded in the practice. Combining it with a solid understanding of the so-called values versus interests dichotomy is a false one. What I really enjoyed it is that, as I always thought about interest as downstream from values, because even the basic things in which people claim our interest is about sovereignty. Sovereignty is a value. You value your right to choose your self-determination over economic benefit of, say, being a part of an empire. It is the false dichotomy that is being forced upon people. And as you very rightly pointed out, our values are our interests, and making it in a very explicit way and grounding it in practice, I think what makes this approach very valuable and practical in solving our problems going forward.
Let me jump in there, because I'm really glad that comes across. And from our beginnings talking about this, it clearly did. And your support for that meant a lot, and encouragement to continue developing it. So that was really, really useful, as well as generally a nice thing to be supported and so on. But this was what was key to me as well, is that it was practical and it would feed back into practice. But it would do that by actually giving the conceptual power that you need in order to coalesce around an idea. So by giving it conceptual power, you could actually give something back to the leaders who pioneered this in the first place. And so when Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Lithuanian foreign minister, described himself as a neo-idealist, this was a hell of a moment for I think any IR theorist, as well as any IR practitioner, would like that kind of thing to happen. And it already did. There's clearly a lot more work to be done. But exactly, this is, saying something's practical when you're calling it idealist is also an interesting provocation to people, which is one of the reasons why I also called this neo-idealism. Partly along the same lines of saying our values are our interests, and we've treated them as marginalized interests for years, but actually they're central, they're fundamental. So you flip that one, invert that, and provoke and bring people in, those who actually get it. And also you say idealism is the most practical response to the threats we face, because that's how we actually keep our societies as worth defending. We live up to the promises that we actually have, and you go about developing and justifying the means to defend them. So this is a very hard-edged version of idealism that has real traction in the real world.
No, I think that is the key. As several people who work on I think it was Morgan Housel, actually a finance writer, who says that it is not the facts or the graphics that win, but it's the best story that wins. And I think providing that that core story for why it is worth to defend our way of life, our values, the way we want to see ourselves and our children to grow up, and providing a name for it is very important in coalescing people around that. I think, as you pointed out, you already made quite a headway in that, and now the trick is, of course, now to expand that and became it so ingrained with our grand strategic thinking that people stop citing you. And that is, I think I would say, would be the biggest win. When it became just a second nature. We just say it and then we move on. And I think that
I'll take the citations first in the meantime.
Exactly.
Yes, definitely. That's exactly it.
We want to get that. Okay, so
it's funny you mentioned this, the name thing there, and that it becomes such second nature. So Alex Vindman, who many of you will know, who used to be on the National Security Council and gained a lot of fame when he very bravely stood up to Donald Trump and testified in his for one of the impeachment hearings that Donald Trump had. Now, Alex has written a number of books. Here, The Truth Matters, for example, but he's got one coming out soon called The Folly of Realism, which advocates a neo-idealist foreign policy for the United States. And I have to say, I laughed when I read this, because Alex and I had a conversation back in October last year when we organized a couple of events on this, and he participated in that. And he said, I love this, but the name, the name. I mean, can we not come up with something else? You know, it doesn't repeat. I don't think idealism is going to work. And I thought, okay, he's been thinking about this for 9 months, but he didn't come up with a better name. So, so I was both gratified about that, but also happy to see that people can find their way in over time. And actually, as they start to acclimatize to what neo-idealism is and why it is idealism, but why that idealism is extremely practical, then more and more people can find themselves in it. And I think you're dead right about the power of narratives. And this has been something that truly inspired me when I first put this stuff out into the world. So I first started writing about this in April 2022 with a piece for Rusi about Central Eastern Europe and about Czechia and Slovakia stepping up in response to Ukraine. Continued to develop it. Then there was a piece that came out in the book, To Ukraine with Love. There was a big essay on that. And I put out a thread on Twitter not long after that, in January 2023, which a 25-tweet thread that got something like 2 million impressions on the first tweet and 4,000 likes about what is essentially IR theory plus grand strategy, a practical approach to IR. And the amount of people whose positive reactions saying, you know, finally something I can believe in, something I can see myself in and see my future in, that really inspired me to keep going with this. And so we've been continuing to develop it as we go along. And it's been very interesting to have the conversations, both with the politicians who are doing this, with experts like yourself and your colleagues, with Aaron Gash-Burnett, who I do the podcast Berlin Side Out with, and our gang here in Berlin, as well as around Europe, and to work out where the holes in it are, where the inconsistencies are, and then to be able to start filling those out. And so I've been going through that process, answering people's questions by writing. So how is it really different to neoconservatism? Well, for one thing, it doesn't impose democracy at gunpoint. It defends it where it exists. Second, it's not actually conservative in a social or cultural sense. And third, it doesn't buy into neoliberal economics, which neoconservatism did. So lest there be any doubt, it is quite different from neoconservatism. But things like that, responding to that. And then in this piece for the MLI, which you kindly encouraged me to do, and were very patient in waiting for it, I should add. So thank you to that, for that, to you and your colleagues. I really tried to round it out in a bigger sense, because it came to me through doing this process that this is as much about domestic renewal of our societies as it is about our international relations. And that's what I tried to lay out in the piece.
So let's use this as an opportunity then to talk about the 8 pillars. And I think domestic component is very important because that's how you generate the power and the political will to be able to defend our actions abroad. So that's very important. So so maybe just lay out the 8 pillars first, and then we can focus on some of them and why that matters. And towards the end, I want to get to your new democratic security initiative and briefly talk about that as well. But first, lay out what the 8 pillars are.
Sure. And these are all in the report, which is in the show notes. So you can go and read this through at your leisure. And the first one is value primacy, which we talked about before, which means values come first. You put your values at the heart of your strategy. So this is about values being our interest, and it's those values I mentioned before. Now, of course, people will disagree on how to define those values, how to distinguish them from each other, and they will debate how best to achieve them. But that's also part of the point. That's a democratic thing in itself. That's actually part of the democratic renewal, is putting those front and center and saying, let's have the discussion about how we go and do that. If we agree those are the goal that we should be striving for first and foremost, then we already show we have more in common than we often think in today's quite polarized, divided societies, where entrenched belief often substitutes for reasoned debate. And so it's partly a goal to actually revive that. So that's the master precept, or the main pillar, if you like, of neo-idealism, value primacy. But from that, I think, flow the other 7 things, and these are all there to be discussed and to be challenged at the moment and to be fleshed out. And I know there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Amazingly, you can't say everything about these things in 500 words, which
that surprises me sometimes. But yes, it keeps happening.
I mean, you can have a crack, but you might not get the full nuanced detail, which some people on social media have a hard time accepting. But nonetheless, I can assure them more is coming on that. So what are the other 7? The magnificent 7 that follow are military readiness. So we have to have 3 things for this to be right. The capabilities to defend ourselves. And this is a crucial part. This is the real hard power element that says, idealism, this is not some utopian, wishy-washy, naive thinking. This is about saying we need to defend the societies that promote those values. And so you need the capabilities to do it and the money to pay for it. which of course means you have to justify it to your society. But you also need the mindset to use those capabilities when push comes to shove. And so you have to be able to project that image. And that signaling about deterrence and defense is extremely important. The authoritarians have to look at us and think, not today. They look a bit tasty to tangle with. So capabilities, money to pay for them, mindset, and also bringing your society with you, not only to pay for it, but to be willing to back that up. When the muck hits the fan, so to not offend Canadian audiences, delicate ears, that's when you need your society behind you as well. Third, effective internationalism. This means getting our institutions, international institutions, fit for purpose. It means understanding again what the purpose of diplomacy actually is, to achieve your interests, which in this case are our values. It's not simply maintaining contact for contact's sake. It's about understanding where your leverage lies. But this is also about understanding that we need a different kind of international order. The international order that we've had, the zombie liberal international order, was working for no one. It wasn't working for liberal states, and it was rigged against a lot of other states, particularly in the global south. So this is about understanding that we need to do better in terms of our institutions, our rules, our norms, and the ways that we interact with others. And we have to be clear about our positioning in that regard. And I found that the Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna's concept of getting the world fit for freedom is extremely useful in that. So I'd encourage people to go and look for more there. But building a more inclusive international order doesn't mean anything goes. It means that we should actually be confident about saying we have a better system if we live up to it. And I think this is about getting the boot on the other foot in a little way and understanding what is our true transformative power. It's if we're strong, people will come to us, rather than us having to reach out and desperately try and court the affections of the global south, etc. So fourth, geoeconomic realism. Realism, shock horror in an idealist framework. But this is actually really realism, not the corruption of it that's been made in international relations and elsewhere. So sorry, John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, etc. I'm still very much opposed to how you view realism, which is anything but realistic. What this is about saying, in geoeconomic terms, we have to understand there are threats as well as opportunities that come from trade, for example. So we've seen the dependencies that we've created with authoritarian states on China for trade and for critical raw materials, etc., key components, for things in our green transition as well as others, but also the resource dependencies that we've created on authoritarian states like Russia. So this is about understanding how we do trade differently and how we get our international economics right, how we do more friendshoring, how do we do more business with our friends in order to actually make sure that our economics doesn't undermine our security, our prosperity doesn't undermine our security. So those are the big four international elements of this that I would say, which are most commonly recognized as what grand strategy has to do with. It's in the other four that perhaps this takes a more, let's say, interesting turn for redefining what grand strategy might be. And I'm not the only one doing that. There are people around grand strategy programs in the US who have been thinking about how to redefine this. So this doesn't come from nowhere, but this came from my thinking through of how to make neo-idealism more complete as a theory and as an approach in practice. And these are inclusive dynamism, eco-modernism, democratic futurism, and societal cohesion. So very briefly, what do those things mean? Inclusive dynamism is saying two things. One is, it is essential that free societies, that liberal democracies are prosperous. We need money, we need wealth in order to advance our material standards of living. We need it to pay for the kind of research and innovation that will keep us at the technological forefront. We need it to pay for the defense that I mentioned earlier. And we need it to pay for the public services that will actually make sure that we provide the kind of quality of life that our citizens rightly demand. And it's fine to want to be wealthy. We should actually be having that as our goal. And the second thing that inclusive dynamism says is that we harness that dynamism, which is the key advantage of free societies, the creativity of free people working through free markets and being rewarded for doing so. But we need to make sure more of our citizens are included in that prosperity, that more of them can feel the benefits of freedom, that more of them can understand in very practical terms why our system is materially as well as morally superior. So that actually then implies a different kind of political economy than we've seen in recent years. This is about saying all citizens and all people living in free societies should be able to reasonably hope for their own betterment. So that's inclusive dynamism. eco-modernism. I won't spend too much time on this, but it's basically a challenge to the degrowth crowd and saying if we want a green transition, and we should want a green future of more rather than less. And this is about saying we need to harness the power of technology. We need to actually take a modernist approach and say, yes, we can master this. We can do more if we actually get our act together, rather than saying it's about imposing things, prohibiting things, and generally taking an anti-democratic approach to it. So that's going to wind some people up, I've no doubt. And I look forward to the discussion going forward with that. Penultimate one is democratic futurism, which is about uncancelling the future, actually rekindling our love affair with the future, saying the future can be better. That tomorrow can be better than today. Our kids can live better than we do. And that's an idea that really fell out of favor in the West from the 1970s onwards, having been the animating drive behind almost all forms of politics across the West for the previous 200 years. People started to feel worse about the future. And so I think we need to change that, but in a credible way. And that does mean embracing technology, because if we don't, as democratic societies, embrace that technology, it will be embraced by others and imposed upon us in ways that we don't like. Think about synthetic biology, think about artificial intelligence, and think about how we need to put our people in charge of that. So last one, possibly most controversially, societal cohesion, community cohesion. This is about saying that we need diverse societies that are nonetheless resilient, coherent, and proud. And that the diversity that is actually a key part of the liberal element of neo-idealism. So social, cultural, and economic liberalism in balanced forms are all part of this. We need that diversity to cohere around a common core that people buy into. And so that this affects how we deal with migration. It affects how we deal with societal division and difference. But it also says that this is not impossible to achieve if we give people the hope of progress. If you're actually looking forward to a better future, you will stop endlessly litigating the past, for one thing. Second, if you understand that we have more in common through those values that were mentioned right at the beginning, then you can see that actually you don't have to take particular characteristics, particular facets of your identity as being essentialized points that define your life and prevent you from truly relating to others. So it's about recapturing that spirit of commonality in diverse societies that should be able to be proud of themselves and say, yes, this is a better way. We are proud to be democratic, which is why we're going to defend it. So that's your 8 pillars of neo-idealism.
No, this is excellent, and again, this should really pique our audience's interest, and you should really go in and read the paper itself to get a better sort of understanding of where we're going. And I really like the international and the domestic component, where we be upfront and proud and confident in our values, and have the means and capabilities and the will to defend them with force, with institutions, and with law on the international stage, on the one hand, and creating the conditions, the domestic conditions of that power and the will at home through focusing on growth, on technology, on inclusiveness, and instead of grievance politics and anti-growth, anti-human, I would say, takes that pushes us towards nihilism and pessimism. And I want to sort of highlight, I'm sure you're familiar with him, but American Enterprise scholar James Petkoholkis has a recent book called The Conservative Futurist. I don't know whether you had a chance to read it, but it lines up so good with what we have been talking about on the domestic front. Its subtitle is How to Create the Sci-Fi World That We Were Promised. And I think that is the key. I mean, if you remember, all the sci-fi 40s and 50s and 60s is about improving. Where is my flying cars, right? And we miss that, and we need to go back and provide hope to people, because we have the technology and the means, and bring everyone together into this, while holding fast into our values that we have highlighted, right? This is not everything goes, as you pointed out, and everyone is welcome. No, there are certain things that you need to be embracing in order to be part of it. but this can be done in a grand scale. And I think this is a great piece. And there's a lot for Canadians here to talk about. Before getting to the Canadian part, I want to, because we're coming towards the end here, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about this new initiative that you're launching, which is quite exciting. It is, to me, it reads like actually putting neo-idealism into practice. We're putting your money where your mouth is, in a way, and getting our hands dirty, rolling up your sleeves, and building the institutions that we are talking about, right? We also need those domestic institutions and international partnerships where we can actually advocate and put this in practice. So talk a little bit about the Democratic Security Initiative, what guided you, and what's the vision you have, and then we want to wrap up with what this means for Canadians. If they need to get one thing out of it or two things out of it, what should be, and we will end up.
Sure. Let me just ask, that book was called The Conservative Futurist?
Yes, it's called The Conservative Futurist by James Petko-Kokis from American.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I mean, to pull that old academic joke out, read it? No, I haven't even taught it. So I haven't read it yet.
An excellent book. One of those books that, I mean, most of these nonfiction books, you just read parts of it. Most of them are not worth reading from cover to cover. This is an exception. This is a book that I enjoyed thoroughly from cover to cover. So I highly recommend it.
I'm looking forward to it now as well, because indeed, I mean, the name of that band that said we were promised jetpacks, exactly, where's that? And this... Yeah. I think you and I are both old enough to remember when this was still the future that was promised.
Yes,
they were still playing Jetsons reruns on our childhood. This is one of the animating questions about all that work I've done in the past on uncancelling the future and so on. And why is it that now still bands like Kraftwerk sound like the future? Well, because we've stopped inventing the future. And that's how the future used to sound, and it's how the future still sounds. But we need to recover that spirit of creation and exactly the hope of progress that you mentioned. And that's I mean, putting the substance into that notion of the hope of a credible future, the right to have a hopeful future. So yes, fully on board with that. I look forward to reading and to see where the overlaps are. And it's interesting to see that one thing I love about neo-idealism so far in doing this project is people from both the center right and the center left find themselves in this in different ways. And you can see maybe where the constellation would fall around, some people identifying more with some parts, some people identifying more with others. But we had a great episode of our podcast with Chris Alexander, who's known to the MLI, known to many Canadian listeners out there, and Paul Mason, who is known to many people in the UK as obviously a centre-left political figure. And so they were able to have, on this basis, talking about neo-idealism, a really constructive chat. And both would consider themselves to be somewhat neo-idealists. And so that, I think, really gives, again, the substance to the notion that we have more in common. And it's about driving those values and having the debate about how to achieve them. So with that said, let me talk about exactly the Democratic Strategy Initiative, which is going to be working with some of those people. And as you said, trying to actually build something that is not only neo-idealist, I should say. It is a broad, open church. But what's the key goal is to build the strategic capacity and strategic culture that free societies need to win the systemic competition. Now, that's no small aim, but as you know me, Balkan, I don't aim low. I mean, we're not shooting rabbits here.
Nope.
Going for big game.
Ad astra, to the side.
Right, per aspera. So this is the point. And we'll start that in Berlin in the autumn, because we think, and that we here is myself, Aaron Gash-Burnett, who is also written for MLI, Canadian-German journalist, and Britta Jakob, who used to work as a foreign policy advisor to the leaders of the Green Party in Germany, recently working for a big German company, has experience across politics and business. The three of us are setting up the Democratic Strategy Initiative, which brings together German politicians, politicians from across the free world, together with officials, experts, German-based and international, and with business, civil society, and media, in order to try and get two forms of team together. Because we think there's two big problems we've had in rising to the challenge that you outlined at the beginning of the show, the double trouble. The challenge from Russia and China and I would add from their proxies, we have not collectively stepped up to meet that challenge. We do not have a credible long-term plan for how to deal with that, let alone while also dealing with climate change, embracing the technological transformation, and continuing to live up to our values and deal with domestic discontent. So we have our hands full, but it's a lot harder if we don't actually develop the strategy that we need to guide our responses to that and create coherent policy across different fields. And it's that strategic deficit that we see as having held us back. Particularly apparent in Germany, it must be said. Canada would have something.
And I would say Canada too.
to add there, yes, indeed. Exactly. It's a reverse beauty contest in that regard, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And those countries that have shown real strategic leadership, the ones I mentioned before, so the Baltic states, Czech Republic, the Nordics, who have really stepped up strategically, have not had that linked up or backed up by some of the bigger players. And this is letting us down overall. And so we really want to address that problem and take it head on. We know it's a big challenge. We know it runs across all those spheres, primarily across geopolitics and geoeconomics, but also the ecological and technological transformations. And we want to be able to create the skills, the knowledge, and the networks that we need to develop the strategic capacity and strategic culture to go about actually forming policy that works across those fields, to create lodestars, to create guiding north stars, if you like, for how we should be acting in ways that align rather than oppose our security and our prosperity. So this is the challenge, and we're very much looking forward to taking it up with building that team domestically between those different actors, actually enlisting business and civil society and ultimately the population itself as strategic players involved in that discussion and involved in its implementation, but also building the international team, harnessing what Roderick Parkes and I called the team power of democratic societies, free societies working together for common goals, which is not something we've done terribly well in the last few years. And Germany, again, has been a poor team player, it must be said. But actually becoming a team player would be the kind of role that would suit Germany's particular political culture, so I would argue. So we're trying to build those two teams, put that at the service of developing strategic capacity and strategic culture, doing targeted analysis where we think there's gaps in knowledge, and some of that will go to filling in the holes in neo-idealism. Some of it will go to providing counter ways to do that, alternative ways of meeting the strategic challenge. And I'm really excited to get into that from the knowledge basis, but also from the network basis of working with all those people I mentioned, with experts like yourself from around the free world, but also with the politicians. And we have a lot of German politicians already signed up to this, which is really exciting, from across the democratic parties. And it builds on the model that we developed with Action Group Zeitenwende over the last 2 years, which we found to be really productive in terms of finding out who the change makers are and how to build them into a nexus. And from a nexus, we're now looking to build it into a team. So that's the challenge we set for ourselves with the Democratic Strategy Initiative.
No, that's very exciting. And it is, again, a very concrete example of reclaiming our agency in creating our own future, a future that's worth defending and striving for, right?
And may I just add, in case any high net worth individuals with a heart of gold are listening, we are looking for supporters to enable us to do that vital work. So don't be shy to get in touch if you want to play your part in saving the free world. Absolutely,
and make sure that you can reach to Ben and Erin on multiple sources through the social media. And it is a very worthwhile effort to support. Let me end by asking you your 30-second take on what our audience in Canada, but more broadly, if they need to take one thing out of this, what's the key takeaway that you would suggest when it comes to neo-idealism and as a grand strategy for the Just Up community?
Canadians believe in and want to live by values that are worth defending. In order to defend them, Canada has to get serious about defending them. It has to have the means to do it, the will to do it, but also it has to have the societal buy-in to do it by actually giving true expression to them at home as well as in Canada's actions abroad. And that's why I would recommend a neo-idealist grand strategy for Canadian domestic and foreign policy.
This is excellent, Ben, and thank you so much once again joining me in Double Trouble. I'm very excited to see and be able to contribute both the Democratic Strategy Initiative as well as taking neo-idealism as forward as a grand strategy, because as you pointed out, I want and you want our children to live in secure, prosperous, free societies, and for us, it's upon us to do the job so that they can do that. And I encourage everyone to join this conversation as we develop and equip ourselves, both in terms of capabilities, but also mindset as we face the challenge that we are facing today in the world. Thank you very much. And for those, again, the report will be in the show notes. Make sure you read it and let us know what you think. Until next time.
Balkan, thanks so much. It's been great to be on the show, great to spread this message to Canadian listeners. And I look forward to not only continuing the conversation, but as you said, the teamwork of building this as grand strategy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben.